Mention Nietzsche, and probably the most common thought that people will have in connection with Nietzsche would be God is dead. And I think the notion of death resonates in all aspects of Nietzsche studies and Nietzsche appreciation and Nietzsche philosophy. Death is never far away. Nietzsche said that he is someone who was born posthumously. He knew that his widespread appreciation and influence would appear after his own death. He knew that because that is the case with most philosophers. Their fame or their influence or their power usually becomes apparent after their death. And in Nietzsche, the death of God, in a sense, underlines this. God becomes a problem in his death. God becomes much more of an intellectual and philosophical issue after his death. His death is a slow one. In fact, his death outlives his life, as is the case in all famous people. Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, Nietzsche. Their short lives are outweighed by their long, long deaths. The shadow of their lives casts a huge death pallor over their future fame, over their significance. One sees that Nietzsche's fame is closely allied to the world wars, his infamy and his fame. He dies in war and he lives in war. He lives in the hearts of warriors who fight in war, and he dies in the minds of propagandists who damn him after wars. So we see in the 50s an emaciated Nietzsche emerge from the war. The Superman is now the subman, the existentialist Nietzsche, thin, pale. He lives in cafes, eking out his existence in teaspoons. That Nietzsche is then taken up in the 50s as an outsider. He's brought back to life again by Colin Wilson, who tells us that Nietzsche is a religious thinker. He abandoned Christianity because it wasn't religious enough. He abandoned it because God had died. Was the Superman his new God? Was the God-shaped hole left by the dying God, the dead God, the decomposing God? Was that God-shaped hole fulfilled by the Superman? By the new man? By the towering man of the 20th century progress? Or the dying man of nihilism, of slumbering Europe, of falling birth rates and declining power? The self-hanged man of Europe, of the Western world, who, like Odin, hangs himself on a tree. The dead God of Jesus, bringing us back always to self-destruction. Our self-destruction outlives our existence. Our small, petty existence is echoed repeatedly in a vicious circle of inverted sub-existence. And we see in the 60s and 70s with the Doors that the Dionysian Nietzsche is brought back into the fold. Jim Morrison of the Doors speaks of the Nietzsche of the birth of tragedy, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, the struggle. And Morrison too, the short life, like Achilles, and the long death, the tragic long death, the birth of tragedy, and the tragedy of death, long death. Death is long. Death outlives us all. Death and taxes. Death, the taxing of death. And we see with the book, no one here gets out alive. The Morrison myth furthers the Nietzsche myth. As the Doors said, Morrison was the greatest promoter of Nietzsche in the modern world. And the film, The Doors, by Oliver Stone, a great film. The Nietzschean, Dionysian, Morrison, the culture hero of the nihilistic world, the world that lives in the shadow of the death of God, the Western world which is dying and is dying on its own feet, as new strange gods come into its territory, its old wild west, and more deaths, more gods, and yet again Nietzsche rears his head, yet again the slow beast slouches towards Bethlehem. The death beast, the Elon Musk beast, the Nietzsche death mask, the Dionysian Superman of death. Death engulfs the earth as we flee to other worlds, like the diseases we are. I teach you the superhumans in death. God is death.